and welcome to the Back to Your Best podcast. Today we have Oliver Crossley joining us. I'm very excited to have him on. We've had a slight delay with some illness over the last couple of weeks, so we finally got here. But Ollie, if you want to introduce yourself, tell people a little bit about yourself, your background, your interests, things like that would be great.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks so much, Dan, for inviting me on. It's it's a pleasure to chat with you. I really love the work you guys are doing, and for the community around Ipswich, it's one of those things where I'm like, gosh, I wish we could just clone you and your team and put you around the world. It'd be a bit better. But yeah, thank you. I'm a physio. Firstly, that's my 9 to 5 or later. Sometimes I have been a physio for 6 years now, but I'm a bit interested in some things outside of that have changed how I've practiced and what I've grown to become interested in as my career's gone on. So I've had a long-standing interest in, yoga and meditation from a broad point of view, specific, types and schools within that. For anyone that's interested, we can talk about that a bit more, but just generally yoga and meditation, it was a really lucky, helpful find. Started uni, and when I was doing the beginnings of a different degree. So when I transferred to physio, it was part of the inspiration to do it and the reason to do it. And then it's since really informed and coloured how I practice and what I do, how I think about problems since, and now the type of problems I work with and people I help. So more people with, persistent chronic pain issues like the people you help, and particularly a growing interest in a lot more time spent helping people with invisible illnesses, which is this sort of broad category of things like from everything from genetic hypermobility disorders like Ehlers-Danlos through to these more recent problems of long COVID, which is a personal experience that sort of half inspired the clinical interest as well. So I work a bit online with a colleague of mine and mentor, Soph Shepherd, who's a pain-titled physio. She's got an online practice, 5 Pain and Fatigue. And then I also help people in person on the Gold Coast through my business, Yogic Physio.
It's such nice to have such a nice diverse range of conditions. And where did you get into the interest of these kind of invisible conditions? What kind of led you down that path?
Good question. I actually really can't remember where it promptly began, but I remember I started writing these set of blogs when I was working and they're still there, thankfully. And because Pogo Physio, the place I used to work for and with Brad Beer, have such a big presence that those blogs go a long way. And so sometimes it comes back to me and someone's read like the mast cell activation, or with this autonomia blog I wrote, I'll publicly confess now that those blogs were like a learning experience. Like they were almost like a learning diary that I then that looked nice to read, and like I knew more than I did at that time. Mostly I think it was through the experience of POTS and the diagnosis that some people close to me had, and then trying to make sense of it. And then it also started to pop up a bit around me. And I don't know why. I think maybe it was the original dysautonomia blog. A couple of local GPs started sending people with long COVID to me. And then I just felt it sort of the momentum carried. It was like a sense of responsibility, but also interest. And it sort of kept going from there.
It's such an interesting... The thing I've always admired about following you and your work is that meditation, mindfulness, yoga, Eastern medicine style that you have to everything. And I find it super interesting because the longer I've been in the game, it's now coming on 12 or 13 years.
Awesome.
The more I seem to kind of come back to this much more holistic, much more, I'll say Eastern, I guess, but it really is just health and broader health.
It is,
things like addressing mindset and addressing stress and helping people kind of more down-regulate, and these things that often aren't really taught in the physio or the chiro spheres very much, let alone most of medicine. And it's been such an interesting observation as I think back over those 10 or 12 years and think now that I'm so much more interested in helping people and find such greater improvements in people when we kind of get to how do we calm the mind a little bit? How do we focus? I do a lot of the breathwork type things. And so I know that's a huge part of your practice and your probably professional and personal philosophy. So tell me a bit more about your background with meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and a bit about how that's incorporated. And then we might even dive a little bit into the science, that kind of connection between chronic pain and mindfulness meditation.
For sure. Personal interest, I could talk about this for hours. The beginning of it was a funny story because I had the intention and plan to, and I did, I had a gap year between the end of high school and the beginning of uni, and I was all set up to study economics, which was where I'd had my head on for a while. But I had this plan to go and volunteer through this organization that did gap year projects in a monastery of all places. Don't know fully why still I chose that. The picture on the brochure looked cool. That's all I remember. It was literally that. And then I did it. I decided it, and it was happening. And I was working out of Darwin and saving up money to do that. This was 2011. And I was off to a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in northern India, where a lot of the Tibetan refugee community have lived since the 60s now. They're very set in as travelers to their note. That's where the Dalai Lama still lives. It's a really fun place to visit. And then I just happened to realize that a cousin of my dad is still lovely lady. I'm very grateful to her, actually, because this is where it began. She is a devout Tibetan Buddhist, and she said, well, I was like, I really want to be more culturally aware, understand where these, like what these people are about, so I can be a useful teacher, hopefully do the job a bit better. I was just teaching English, and she went, I'll read this book. And it was Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by a teacher, Sogyal Rinpoche, who's quite famous in that world. And I read that 17 years old on this pearling boat, saving up money to go. And I had this moment where I read, I guess anyone interested in Buddhism would see the Four Noble Truths as being one of those like pretty well-known foundational concepts. And it just hit me, and I was like, why wasn't I told this when I was like 4? It feels like as useful as addition and subtraction or literacy. And so the fire started. And then after that, going there, it was quite hard to learn much about it, because what I've learned was that a lot of people over there were more culturally Buddhist, and that the real devout practitioners were quite hard to find. But on the flip side, I was lucky to be in a monastery I've now realized was quite famous, Tashijong or Kampagar Monastery, that is part of a particular school of Tibetan Buddhism that really emphasizes practice. So much so that these people, some of these yogis, monks that then go on to higher levels, if so you speak, like someone studying to becoming a PhD or whatever, getting a PhD, they do these 12-year retreats. It blew my mind, coming from Australia, just like such a foreign concept of how to live or, spend part of your life, a big chunk of it. And I particularly got to meet someone who's now quite well known, an English lady, Tenzin Palmo, who became a nun, I think in the 60s or 70s, and learnt from the one of the monks who ran the monastery I lived at. And so I went to a couple of her talks, and then just the story's got quite a lot of detail, but I guess from there on a fire was lit, and I couldn't, there was this insatiable special interest in it that it became more and more obvious, and it continues to, the more I read, the more I practice, of just how useful this is and how much it has changed me for the better and made me more useful to others, I think. I then also happened to drop into a yoga class, and so the physical stuff was really cool. Like I was quite an anxious, uptight kid trying to get, the best academic score I could to get into economics and all the rest. And I'd never really been given the experience that I now spend most of my work trying to facilitate, of just being pretty okay with the moment as it is. And it's such a cliched concept, but really if you dive down to it, that experience is, to me, just like one of those fundamental human experiences that I hope all people can get access to. And this is what I think these practices do, because the more we spend time in those experiences, the more they show us something different that's quite helpful. And the physical practices of yoga, that first class, gave me that. And so I was hooked. Came back home, long story short, went to Melbourne Uni for a bit, realized economics wasn't really what I wanted to do. My grandma was a physio. Her diploma from the 40s is behind me, if for anyone watching. Chatting with her, we're like, why don't we do that? Parents lived in Townsville. I could live and, study there pretty easily with their support. And so I did. Got into physio, found a great yoga teacher in Townsville, and yeah, the rest is history. I'm still learning, practicing, figuring out now. And that's why I live on the Gold Coast. My teacher is here. It's the reason I'm here.
Yeah, right. So you moved specifically just to be closer to the future.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so what does this look like in practice? What, when you're working with a client, let's just say someone with chronic pain, and you're utilizing these practices, what does that look, what does that entail for the average person who comes to see you?
I am quite transparent with this, that I'm still figuring this out, because it ties into the deeper question of what does a service that like yourself or myself provide look like these days. And I think people's expectation of physio or of most healthcare is this very sort of power imbalance. They tell me what to do. They tell me what I need. Very prescriptive. And I think there's still some value in that sort of relationship for some people, but it's a lot more collaborative. And so what it looks like is really increasingly quite different. And I like kind of aim for that it's a very N equals one for the scientists out there, or very individualized, that it's not one practice for everyone. Because the more I understand the science and the real good and bad aspects of these practices, like anything we do, you want to understand the safety of it. And so a lot of it is very individualized, very tailored to their context, preferences, needs, wants, and the rest. But generally it involves some focus, some change, modulation of their attention to go inward rather than outward, and somewhere along the line maybe involve movement and breath regulation as part of that. Yeah, to put it.
Yeah. And so then to dive into maybe the more sciencey side of the question with chronic pain and things like that, what's the connection there? What's the connection between, let's just say, breath work, the meditation style part of the practice, and yoga, and how does that all kind of connect? Because I know with my clients, we don't go too deep on the meditation side of things, but we do try draw awareness a bit internally when they're doing their rehab with us, and a lot of focus on breath work and body scans and things like that. But it can often be quite hard to understand, like, how does that actually have an effect on our pain? How does being a bit more mindful or using meditation as a practice impact pain?
Yeah, well, that question I think is still being answered as we speak. And it's something that we were just talking before the call, I've been lucky to be accepted into a master's program at UQ to be part of that journey that the rest of the world is figuring out. We do know a bit already though. And I guess if I could summarize it, I think it ties in with the understanding that we've gained with these complex, persistent presentations of pain and fatigue, and how, like any human health issue, they're not very well understood by, I guess, a more reductionist or like isolated test tube in a lab approach of, oh, it's just this one thing in the bloodstream that's wrong. And even if that's true, it's this shift in perspective that we are interdependent and interconnected, and that there's layers outside and within us that are important to pay attention to as part of this health shifting journey. Recovery, rehab, however we want to describe it, that, your social, psychological, biological context, all these different things matter. And so these different layers, these different perspectives can all be different ways that you can look at these practices themselves. So whether it's, changes in how they, for some people, affect their autonomic nervous system, that balance of, rest and digest and fight and flight, which we're still making sense of, for some of these practices, they actually increase activity in both, which is interesting. But then the felt experience might be one of more safety, connection, and present moment awareness. Then on the clinical side, they can actually be an assessment tool even, that, a body scan that I'm sure you use with your clients and I do, can actually be a way of getting the person to have more understanding of their symptoms and why they're changing and what's behind that. So it's a vehicle for understanding, not just an intervention itself to change experience maybe. And then the other part of it is, it depends. It comes into like a lifestyle thing or a recovery buffer, other practices or, exercises or things happening in their life to allow for some space. Like one client just before I talked with you today was an example of this, where we've been doing more physical yoga practices, for example, but there was a lot happening. They were feeling overloaded, quite fatigued. And so we actually just did a very passive lying down, I guess, practice, if you will, of guided attention and breathing. That then it basically was me just trying to secret agent, trick them into relaxing and letting go and resting, because we're all so busy, we're all so frantic that our body's pretty good at resolving its own problems and healing. It's much like a plant in a garden. It's just supporting it to be able to do that. And I think these practices really function on those two things of helping us understand what's missing or how those plants are best situated in the garden, if we're those plants, and then and then nourished in the process of that.
Yeah, it's such a nice view. I love the garden or the plant analogy as well. And I remember we were at the Greg Lehman workshop.
That's right.
Like 2 years ago, maybe it was now. And he had this great graphic, which really I took a lot away from and probably made me start to think more on this side of things a little bit more, where he said we've got strategies to build the body up, to build more resilience in the body, which is often strength and flexibility and more physical in nature. And then we've got strategies to help kind of down regulate. So pain management strategies and things along those lines. And tell me, I'd love to hear your opinion on it, but the way that I kind of approach it with my patients is when we're trying to down regulate and if we've got someone who's very stressed or anxious, not sleeping well, they've just got a lot going on in their little world. And you can just tell that their back pain, for example, there might be some physical to it. Maybe they do need to stretch their hammies a bit, or maybe they do need to do some glute bridges. But the reality is, if we could just get them to downregulate their nervous system, just kind of find a little bit of mental space through some practice of meditation or mindfulness or something along those lines, likelihood we'll see a good reduction in their pain, and they'll find a little bit of relief just through those strategies. And so that's kind of the way that I visualize it, is like, how much do we need to build you up, or how much do we need to kind of calm you down? Is that, with your experience and knowledge in that field, is that a good way to approach it? Is that kind of a relatively level-headed approach to help people like that?
Yeah, I think so, to be honest. I'm a big fan of Greg and that way of approaching practice, and I guess anything we do with people. And even I even say it to people, like, we're doing it like this. We've got, my job's simple. We're either doing one of these two things, or even like a third thing. It's like a tripod. It's like making sense, building up, calming down, a good map, getting us stronger, and giving us some relief. And so, yeah, I agree. It fully fits into that. There's nuance within that, like cautions as to where sometimes it is and doesn't, and then how to actually achieve that. But generally, you're right. Yeah. Like, we're all, burning candles at both ends, not really as able to access those states, like I mentioned, that I was lucky to experience early on and try and keep going now, of just non-doing. I won't get too abstract, but just being okay in the present moment. Like, we've all had it, sitting by the campfire, watching a sunset, hanging out with our family. I think these are like fundamental human experiences. They're just harder to access. And so these are just tools that for a large chunk of people are pretty good at doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a skill. Like, I meditate a few times a week.
Awesome.
And it took me a long, long time of practicing. I do guided meditations. I've got my headphones on, and Sam Harris is the guy.
Me too.
He's out, so I really like it. So I've got his voice in my ears all the time.
That's a good voice, yeah.
It is a nice voice, actually. But the thing that it took me a long time to learn how busy my mind was. As in, if you'd sit down on the couch and you'd start, and within like 10 seconds, my brain was like, what am I doing later on today? And it took so much practice just to find that kind of silence up there, and to kind of switch off in a way, at least just kind of switch off those kind of external voices, about what else I've got to do in that moment. And I find that can be a challenge for a lot of people, because it's not a skill set you can really build in a half hour or an hour, physio or chiro session.
If only.
It's something that people have to buy into firstly. They have to want to do that. And it's a practice that requires a lot of patience, and it requires you to be consistent, and all these kind of things.
All these difficult things.
And also we're good at being switched on. We live in a world, I think, that we are good at being busy and on the go and things to do. And we're kind of wired in a society these days to be that way. And it's very difficult for people to just switch off and do the opposite of that. And where's your recommendation for people to start with things like that? Is it through an app, like that's how I kind of started, I guess, with it all, and just some guided meditation? Or is it actually through a teacher, a coach of some sort?
That is a great question. Depends, which is that classic annoying response to every question, but it depends on your context and your motivations. I will always feel like the Waking Up app is a pretty good start for anyone. For particularly people that aren't so interested in, certain tones of voice or subtle beliefs that are hijacked into these practices sometimes. We don't want to hear the waffly yoga teacher talk about nonsense. And I'm that person, even though I have been in the yoga world for a while now, like over a decade and a half. There's a lot of these barriers, and you mentioned some of the big ones that if we flipped meditation for exercise, it would be the same. I think it's the same as that, is what helps me facilitate an exercise habit or any other habit. It's finding, you cannot beat, I think, the power of like community and other people doing the thing, but that's really tricky, I think, particularly in Australia. My practice has been kept alive in its toughest times by the community I practice with, which is lucky because it's quite diverse and really relaxed. There's, a weird cult that you have to sign up to, but these apps are great. I I do think having that human to human relationship though is really key. So if the community is a bit out there or inaccessible, and if the app is really impersonal and technical and something you keep dropping, that I hear from some people, and they're not the rare person like yourself that's been able to keep it up. Impressive, by the way. Not trying to buddy you up, but that's really cool. The next middle step, I think, is seeing if there's people around you that know this stuff, that are a little bit further along. You know, like anything, if you want to practice guitar, you probably find someone that's pretty good at it that you don't mind talking to and learning from. And that's a really good step, because my teacher, my mentor, has been a massive help. And I don't see him or talk to him that much about the practice. He's a yoga teacher as well, so I've got two in one, but I'll chat to him in depth maybe once every 2 months, like a therapist, I guess. And it's just a really good resource to help me out. So there's that sort of split between community, individual coach, teacher, and these apps. But Headspace is a great start for many. And then I think Waking Up is just one of those ones that really has the depth to it, so that you really, it's one that you can take a long way. And many clients and friends have, whether they're trying to do it for just personal stress relief or symptom change, or even like contemplative goals.
Yeah. Yeah. Headspace is, for me, Waking Up, I like the science, understanding science.
And that's what's good about it.
And I think he's not too deep on it, but he's deep enough that you feel like there's some good research and good science backing the practice and the benefits of it as well. It is such an interesting kind of area in the allied health space, let's say, because I might be my bias and chatting to people like you and being more attracted to people who practice like that and reaching out to them. But it does seem slowly like those kind of practices are coming along. I remember I went to a Craig Levinson workshop in Sydney also a couple of years back, and
awesome.
We were lucky enough to see him actually do a proper assessment. He actually had a Sydney client of his. He works in LA, and at the time he said, "Why don't you come?" Said to this client, "Why don't you come in? We'll do a full assessment, and you can." A group of us got to watch it, and the very first thing he did. And just for context for people listening who don't know Craig Levinson, he's very, very well known he's a chiro, one of the good ones. And he's
a great one.
And he's written textbooks on rehab, and he's a bit of a leader in the space. And he started the first 5 minutes on breathwork and body scan with his and so the first 5 minutes was a very quiet environment. Granted, it was at a gym, so it was as quiet as you can get it, but it was quiet. He got the guy into a really calm state, did this beautiful body scan, and then got up and did the physical, challenged him, trained him in different ways, and then finished the session with another body scan and some breath work. And it was really amazing just to see the connection between the psychological, mental, mindfulness side of an assessment combined with some heavy lifting and challenging rehab work.
That's so good.
And then finishing again. And for me, it was this approach that is about as holistic, I think, as an assessment, can get. And it was just mind-blowing just to see the changes that this guy felt in person. He wasn't making any of this up, the testing, all of that kind of stuff.
Real experience.
And I think that is where for me, that connection with the mindfulness and rehab comes in, whereas when we can get people to really connect with their body, we get much more out of the rehab, whether that be stretching. Obviously, that's very interconnected with yoga style practices. Let's just say stretching stuff for now. If you can get someone to really kind of feel their body and find a lot of body awareness just by being very well connected from the mind and the body, to some like isolated activation work, to some heavy lifting of some sort, that for me is the connection between the mindfulness and the strength work and the rehab, I think.
Bingo.
And I'm a big advocate for, at our clinic here in the Back to Your Best program, we call it mindful-based rehab, which is people being in the moment, being present, listening to their body. And I think it is so much easier for those who've had a little bit of practice in mindfulness meditation to kind of get that straight away versus most people, I'd say, who haven't had that experience, and we have to try get that connection and get them just to kind of quieten the mind a little bit and listen to their body a little bit, which can be quite challenging. But observationally, we see such big differences between the people who have those connections and who don't. And I've got a patient who's just in mind as I'm saying all of this, and she is big into the mindful meditation stuff, and she had a lot of chronic pain, a lot of stress, anxiety attacks, and all this kind of stuff. And it led to all these back issues. And we were working a lot through the process on the typical rehab type stuff. And along the way, we were just kind of dropping some hints, I guess. And she really got into meditation. She does it insanely now. Like, it's amazing. And she's a whole different person now. It's quite amazing. She got on top of her stress and anxiety very, very well. And that was the big handbrake in her back rehab process, was that she just needed to get on top of that, and she went all in on it. And it's just, yeah, again, one of those stories that really opens your mind as to how powerful it can actually be.
That's so wonderful. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I love these stories because they keep you motivated. Sometimes I know, like, it doesn't always work for everyone, or it's hard to facilitate. And like you said, these things take practice and time and patience. And in a world where those things aren't as incentivized or as valued as much, sometimes it makes the literal goal at the end of the rainbow of these practices more challenging to reach. And so when you hear these stories, or you hear the lived experience of even your practice, it's very valuable to keep it alive.
And like you said before we got onto the podcast, that, you see people kind of at the end of the line, right? They've generally been through doctors and chiro physios, whoever, and end up at you because they haven't found a resolution for their issues.
Yeah.
Do you think those people are typically just generally more open to it because they've tried everything else, and then they get to that point and that, last person that they see, say when they come to see yourself, they are much more open to it because it's something they haven't tried yet, or it's something that maybe has been mentioned a few times along the way and they just haven't been in the space or had the time to actually commit to something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And it's always differs a bit because there's always still resistance to weird and wacky things. And it makes sense because I keep framing the whole way that these problems arise and how we work with them through what I generally call a body budget understanding of it. It's this understanding that, like, pain, aside from what it's trying to communicate in whatever context, it's always different for everyone, so I'll keep it general, is part of, it's stressful. It's a protective, expensive experience, and it drains us and makes us more, all of the bad things, irritable, stressed, sleep deprived, other health issues pop up. And so when people are in that state, they're both exasperated and just going like, yeah, sure, I'll do anything, which does make the clinical work a bit easier. I'm less of a salesman these days, but on the other side it's still very much like keeping it in a bite-sized chunk to have it feel accessible and to have a win, I guess. It's like with movement. I'm sure you would think like this all the time because what you do for people is this. It's wonderful. When pain restricts us and brings us down into this narrow circle, it's a metaphor has been used many times before. The room we have to move in any regard is tiny, whether it's scanning our body and feeling safe even doing that, or moving, exercising. And so the art, I find, is trying to get an experience of safety in that small window. And yeah, luckily it's a little bit less risky to use your attention in your body. It's still tricky and fraught because the trauma-informed side of things is really important. And thankfully that's been a real shift in the last 10 years. Like David Treleaven wrote a great book on that in 2018, and there's been some research, but it's yeah, sorry, I'm off on a bit of a tangent, but yeah, it's good.
So the next thing I kind of want to talk a bit about, and it's something that I'm seeing more and more in the clinic, and I'd love if you could kind of define these conditions and maybe just give a bit of background for people. But we seem to be working more and more with people with EDS and POTS and these kind of, like you alluded to at the beginning, these kind of invisible conditions, I guess, if they fall into that category, I'm actually not sure. But, these kind of conditions that they're becoming a little bit more known. We're definitely seeing it more in the clinic. And I know you work a lot with people with these conditions. So could you tell people a little bit about EDS, or if there is more of an umbrella term for these kind of things, and POTS, and what they are and how we might help people with them?
The invisible side, I think, is a real community or lived experience label that's come from those that live with this, which I think is always nice. Anytime, like, nothing about me without me, especially now research and treatment wise, to really be collaborative include. And so invisible illness just refers to the thing that basic understanding that it looks like nothing's wrong with these people, and that's why they're so stigmatized and misunderstood and mistreated for so long, which is really unfortunate. But I think the tide is starting to shift, and that's why you're even talking about these terms being well known now, thankfully, or better known. It's a real spectrum of diverse conditions that where some are more like quite specific that we've got a pretty good biomedical understanding of in terms of, bringing it down to something like genetics and connective tissue disorders like Ehlers-Danlos syndromes, which is a collection of different variations of what we largely believe is about to come out. New diagnostic criteria is, I think, going to be released next year on this from the EDS Society. Great resource for anyone that wants to learn more or help someone or understand more maybe about themselves. That we think come down to how our DNA allows for these connective tissues to grow and repair and replace themselves, and they're not as high a quality, if you could use that word. So they tend to be more prone to easy damage, easy injury, and not as dense, not as. And so these people, you'll see hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is we think, most common variation of this. And these are the people we see the most. I see them a lot in yoga. You see them a lot in circus arts, because like any sport or physical activity, it tends to self-select for those that can do the thing a bit easier.
Yeah, we actually work underneath a pole dancing studio. There's a pole dancing so that's actually probably why we see quite a few of them now, is because they love that stuff. Obviously, it requires
exactly.
So it just fits into what does come a bit more naturally to them.
Bingo, yeah. And that's the cool thing, is that we can, look at these communities and start to go, but it doesn't, you got everyone symptomatic. And so then other variations or other conditions, like you mentioned, there's a lot. So I'll try and keep it brief. POTS is the big one, which is an acronym, POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So it's a mouthful, very easy to remember for people. POTS is a description. It's a condition that's been, I guess, described in the literature and the research for a while now. And we've got some pretty good understanding about maybe why it's happening, but we're not sure exactly. And there's argument about whether there's different types. So it's really a blood volume issue, we think, and a heart rate change with postural change. So it's diagnosed pretty simply, thankfully. So it's one of those ones that you can talk with health professionals, doctors that might not be aware of it pretty easily just by showing them the diagnostic criteria, which I think this American College of Cardiology, Rheumatology are the biggest or the latest sort of communicators of that. But it's everyone agrees across the board that it's an increase of 30 beats per minute or more in your heart rate when you move from a sitting or supine, sitting or lying position to standing. And that happens without a drop without a drop of blood pressure more than a certain amount, generally 20 beats per minute. There's slightly different criteria for adolescents where it's a little bit more flexible, but it's this disproportionate increase because you think about it, gravity is a pretty strong force. And if our blood follows gravity like most fluids do, when we stand up, it's all going to go down. And so generally we think that our blood vessels counteract this and, like anything else in our body, adapt to these changes and try and maintain a steady state, a homeostasis of where the blood's going. And so we think very loosely, one of the ways of describing this is that the blood vessels, at least in the legs, aren't as responsive for whatever reason. Either it's a connective tissue issue, generally also some viral autoimmune insult, hence why we're seeing a lot of this more after COVID. That then means that the blood volume's not going back up to the upper body or back into the heart as easily or as quickly. And so the heart freaks out, the autonomic nervous system goes protect, and we get this increase in heart rate. We get a shift into a more sympathetic state, which means more fight or flight. And so what does that mean? It means that blood doesn't get directed to the things that rest and repair is involved with. So not our digestive tract, not the things that keep us calm. So you'll get feigning experiences, you'll get gastrointestinal distress, and all manner of other symptoms. Like I could spend a whole podcast describing POTS, but the experience is I think one that can be changed. We're still learning a lot about it. Some people's experience is incredibly severe and disabling to the extreme. Others, it's milder. Katie Ledecky, the famous US swimmer, has it. Even a recent a pro triathlete that I follow, Steph Clutterbuck, recently got diagnosed, but she's been still active. And so it's difficult because it's a syndrome like Ehlers-Danlos. There's a wide variety. Long COVID, the rest. I'm mindful of time. I could talk about lots of these, but dysautonomia is generally the other umbrella within this that describes them all. Autonomia just being autonomic nervous system functioning and how that really affects everything. Even pain is a common symptom across this, and dys being a dysfunction in it. People will, it's physiological anxiety almost. And that's where I think, unfortunately, because it affects more women than men, there's been a bit of medical misogyny, to say the least, where it's too easily palmed off as anxiety because, like most humans, doctors, health professionals, physios, the rest of us, chiros, are not very comfortable with uncertainty. And when there's something happening that doesn't quite make sense, that we don't have a map or a term for, then you default to the most easy description because it's uncomfortable to recognize that we don't know. And unfortunately, that's meant that people haven't been cared for as well as they could have.
Yeah. Yeah, I was telling you also before some of the stories of some of our clients who've had it, and it's just a mess, really. But what someone with POTS, let's say, what are some of the management strategies or the general approaches that we need to take with these clients to help them?
Thankfully, it's really nice and simple, and all quite affordable, simple things. Not too many fancy drugs. The medical specialist you do really want to get in contact with is a POTS-aware cardiologist, or a cardiologist that's willing to be POTS-aware, because there are certain medications like beta blockers that can just be really, really helpful for keeping things under control. But when it comes to things that you and I can recommend and that people can access anytime, anywhere, it's about generally 3 things, if I can remember the third. First is it's fluid salt compression. That's it. I always get them mixed up because fluid and salt are often combined with our electrolytes. So if it's a blood volume issue, we can counteract that somewhat by just increasing blood volume. And so these people are ones where the usual recommendations for a certain amount of fluid, a certain amount of salt each day goes out the window. And we go hardcore, up to 3 liters a day sometimes. And you have that with quite a bit of salt. So generally for an average adult, I think it's around, 2 to 3 grams of salt, where I think maybe the recommendations with like the dietary guidelines are around 1 gram of extra added dietary salt.
Does it matter? Yeah, is it just dietary salt or electrolytes?
Yeah, it does. I think from clinical experience, I've learned it does matter. Too many people who just hear that and have a cursory understanding like I once had, just say, oh, let's have salt tablets. But sometimes when salt, as we know, if anyone's tried this, is delivered in a condensed form, it has an osmotic effect, and you get some distress in your stomach. So I find electrolyte solutions, salt dispersed through food. The cool thing is you can do this in a bunch of different ways. One of the old ladies I help loves Vegemite, hates electrolytes, so we just go hard on the Vegemite every morning, and it helps a bit. So you can do it in many ways. Sodi is one of those brands that I should be sponsored, but I'm not, is a big love of many in the community. My partner loves it, and I've even found it helpful because I've had orthostatic post-viral symptoms, and it's a more salt-heavy electrolyte, unlike the sport ones you can get from Coles. And that's the key, because the sodium increases the blood volume. And then lastly, compression. Because if those blood vessels in the legs are the big thing that are not working as well as they could, compressive wear, and generally like a higher grade, certain brands do it pretty well.
Compressive garments.
Yeah. So
skins,
tights.
if they still exist. But
socks don't work.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, apologies, interrupting.
Yep. No, I was just going to say, we're talking something like skins or those kind of compressive garments. If skins exist anymore, I don't know. But
actually, that's a good point. I remember wearing those playing rugby.
Yeah.
I think they still exist, actually. Someone said that the other day. But word on the street from the smarter women in my life have told me that Lorna Jane is pretty good. Lululemon, not too bad. But Lorna Jane, I think, has got the stronger ones. And then I think it's Superfit that's one of the brands that does the more medical grade compression. Because you're generally looking at, I think it's around 20 to 30 milligrams of mercury of pressure. So quite severe. And I think the cost of this, the downside is that the effort it takes to put these tights on can often be such a symptom aggravator that it's almost not worth putting on in the first place. And many of us in Australia live in hot, humid climates, and many people with POTS are also neurodivergent, have sensory processing or sensory preferences that don't not line up. And so compression's one of those last ones where it's like, if you can, if it's all right. And then it leads into dietary stuff where there's some really good dietitians out there that can help them out, because one of the unknown things with this is that a lot of gut microbiome fecal loading is to me, it's one of the cues where people might not realize they have POTS or something like this, but they yo-yo between constipation and diarrhea with no other real solid explanation, and everyone health-wise around them is confused as to what's going on.
Does exercise come into that as well?
Yeah, that was my final thing. So I think it does, and there's some really good research to show that it does, with take it with not just a grain, a kilo of salt. POTS joke, haha. But no, the risk is pretty high. Because one of the things that's not been recognized alongside this dysautonomia conditions, and oh my gosh, ME/CFS, how could I forget? Myalgic encephalomyelitis, or it's sometimes referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome, another complex one that I won't get into too much because it requires a bit more description, but it's defined by a key symptom called post-exertional malaise or post-exertional symptom exacerbation that links it with things like POTS and links it with long COVID, sort of unites these three conditions. Now, the problem with people with POTS getting exercise as treatment is that they will try and do the recommendations where there's been some really good protocols, like I think it's the Pittsburgh or the Philadelphia Children's Hospital protocol, and then I'm forgetting the other hospital. There's been a series of American exercise protocols, and it's pretty simple. It's cardiovascular based. It's 1 to progressing 3 times a week, shorter sessions in lower heart rate zones, 60 to 70% of heart rate building up, because we know that exercise is reliably a good way of increasing blood volume. But the caution around this is that because their nervous systems are in this heightened protective state and the immune system around it's really tricky, we need to be aware for these post-exertional malaise symptoms. And what that is a dramatic increase in fatigue, brain fog, pain, a range of things that are disproportionate to the level of physical, cognitive, emotional, or sometimes environmental stimuli or exertion.
Interesting, because it's a little bit outside the realm of it. I think addressing things like sodium. We have Sodi here. It's been one of the most popular things products we actually sell.
It's a good product.
And so shout out to them, and definitely for the people that we have with POTS, they feel, just reported from them, but feel completely different. And it's just that high level of sodium. But it's those kind of external things, I guess, around POTS and managing it that many people I think don't know, getting that.
No, they don't. They can make a big difference.
Yeah. And then coming into the EDS side of things, what kind of recommendations for people with these kind of connective tissue disorders, and often associated with persistent pain for many of them as well?
For sure.
What are the general recommendations to help those people?
It's quite similar to everything else, I think. The rehab principles for fellow professionals and people living with these conditions, or friends and family that might out there that are listening, the principles for getting people functioning are quite universal. Like you've said, calm stuff down, build stuff back up. Understand the issue. I think firstly it's about being validated and understanding the issue and going, okay, it makes sense why XYZ symptoms keep arising, because my connective tissue isn't as good at keeping itself at a high integrity or repairing itself as quickly as another person who doesn't have this condition. So it's being aware of how to support that. A marathon, not many marathon runners, I live in the Gold Coast, not many Gold Coast marathoners would be running barefoot last weekend. They were wearing these fancy new shoes because it's a support. And we think of that like, oh, of course you would. And it's similar with these people. There are certain braces, certain aids that can just allow them to, because they use so much more energy, so much more effort, or their body budget to do regular things, because their body's just trying to hold itself together. Their muscles are overworking, their nervous system, all these extra comorbidities, that often it's then just coming in with supports and going, okay, where can we take the load off? Where can we calm stuff down? And that is around some really cool, unique products like a body braid, which is like a whole wrapping set of compressive sort of slings that people can wear, and a range of other supportive slings and braces that are thankfully getting more accessible and better designed for people in this community. Then it's about thinking about where they're wanting to go. And this lines up with POTS and the rehab process for these other conditions. It's going, well, what's the unique context this person lives in, and what's the functioning that they want to have? Are they like one client who's getting through med school? She's a brilliant young woman, but she's needing these aids. And so it's just going, okay, well, we're focusing on getting you functioning there. And so this means that you might wear an AFO, an ankle brace, to take that strain off that really tricky, wobbly ankle for a while. And I think that the difficulty and where a lot of the stigma and gaslighting can creep back in is that some of the interventions for this community can seem I think it's just that what people might refer to as ableism, where they go, oh, you don't need to wear that. Or if you wear a neck brace, your neck muscles will get weak. These things that allied health professionals, rehab professionals like yourself and myself might think before. And I'm still concerned about it. But these people are trying so hard that wearing something like a neck brace that you might think they've just had a car accident actually just allows them to catch a break and recover and focus when they're at work or at a lecture or anything. So the Ehlers-Danlos conference was fun because you just saw all these wonderful people walking around with all these aids, and it's becoming more normalized.
Yeah, it's a good point you just raised with the aids and support, because I definitely work with EDS has made me rethink that, even the use of like postural.
Yeah.
They're called, but those postural kind of things you can throw over your shoulders, which I normally have a pretty solid foundation of saying just, don't worry too much. But then when
me too. I've been there.
It's the flip side. It's like, you need that extra support when you need it. Like your body's working overtime just to hold you upright. It can be enough to generate all that aches and pains that you are actually the person who this stuff would work probably really well for. You still want the strength. You still want all that stuff.
Yeah.
But gosh, if you're going to make your life a little bit easier and a little bit less or a little less painful, why not? These are those times where that works.
Bingo, yeah. And that build them up process, I think that like you and your team do so well, that's where it's so individualized. Because for one person, high load strength training, as I think there's some great influence on social media talking about this with lived experience, is massively helpful for these people with hypermobile EDS, like as the common example. Whereas others will be completely wiped and sent into a fatigue spiral, and small Pilates-based movements are better, or pool-based exercise. I've got friends and colleagues in the yoga community, 2 women I can think of that are likely undiagnosed, that are like highly functional and into their like 50s doing really dramatic movements. But I have the secret hypotheses that a lot of these people they've been able to cope because systems like yoga or, exercise movement systems like this have allowed them the tools to really manage themselves and lift their window of tolerance and capacity to handle life. And so then these symptoms don't pop up and they maybe don't seek diagnosis.
I was going to ask, just as we finish up here, that question actually on heavy lifting for people with EDS, because we've just found kind of in the clinic here with some of our people in our program, they've done really well with heavy load. We've definitely found better with high load, like trap bars are kind of my favorite at the moment.
Love it.
For them, because there's not a huge range of motion, but we can go real heavy and get a big neurological muscular stimulus without too much excessive loading on the joints or end range.
Bingo.
Joints. Is there much research to kind of support that observation, or is it just helps everybody anyway?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I try and read as much as I can, but I always like to make sure that I really do say I don't know when I don't know. So there's probably research coming out, and I think there is because it's moving so quickly. Gosh, my Google Scholar alerts are mental and they fill my email inbox. I don't know any specific research because this is only beginning to be researched anyway. However, anecdotally and like thinking through how I reason through things, it's the same as you. I think any human hypermobile or not benefits from a safe high load stimulus for what it does to the body, if it's emphasis on that safety. And so I think the hard part for that population is just figuring out how to do that. And a trap bar like you've given an example of is a great version of that exercise, because what's missing for these people, and I think where some dogma still remains even in fellow professionals that help those with hypermobility, is that end range loading isn't safe, or high load movement isn't safe. And it's sort of yes, but no. Because end range high load movements like the dynamic Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga practices that I do, or the gymnastics or the contortion clients. My first ever Ehlers-Danlos client, who's now a training physio, she is a contortionist and a circus performer and is actually better when she loads these positions. So what it comes down to is the difficulty with proprioception that they have and anything that aids that. And that high load neurological stimulus that you provided the example of through deadlifts is awesome. It does the same, similar things to anything else. And so it's just creating that where their joints don't give them the feedback to tell them where they are in space. Can we substitute that for something else as we create this, healthy stimulus of any kind, Hence why rowing, recumbent bike stuff is good with a cardio thing. These controlled machine-based, resistance movements, good heavy deadlifts. There's so many examples. And I think that's the nice thing, is that the options are endless. It's just about collaboratively working with someone that can understand it and create safety for you in line with what's interesting. Because, I think everyone should strength train, but not everyone wants to.
Well, that's so interesting, all the EDA. I mean, I just hope more and more physios like yourself and chiros and whoever just start to understand these conditions better, start to work more holistically and thinking outside of the little box that we're often taught at uni, and in how to think in a very refined way, which often doesn't help people in the real world. So thank you for all the stuff you put out. As I said, I love the post that you pop up
Thank you.
and the knowledge
Likewise.
that you put out. And I've read a few of your blogs on your site, which have been really, really insightful. But for anybody who wants to find out more about yourself, where can they find you?
For sure. I live mostly on Instagram, for better or worse, at Yogic Physio, YOGIC, and I've got my website of the same name, where you can find me and read the odd blog that I put up about this stuff and some thoughts. I also co-run a podcast and work with Soph Shepherd at Vive Pain and Fatigue, where I work most of the time online for anyone that can't make it to the Gold Coast. And we talk about this stuff in a bit more detail and try and share valuable information like you do, Dan. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm grateful that you're doing what you're doing. Your Ipswich is the better for it.
Appreciate it. All right. Thanks, mate.